A German supply convoy crawled along a timber road deep in the Polesian lowlands. Beneath the wheels, the planks creaked and sank into the mud. Reeds swayed on both sides, their whispering taller than the men. Ahead, the road vanished into mist. Beyond that mist lay an ocean of wetland, and mouldy pools the Pripet Marshes. Few soldiers among them had ever seen a landscape like this. In their minds, the Eastern Front was supposed to be open country, wide plains for tanks and fast movement. Yet here, where southern Belarus met the Ukrainian frontier, the earth itself rebelled against motion. The Germans had expected Soviet divisions, not a geography that could swallow an army whole. The Pripet Marshes stretched over 250,000 square kilometers, one of the largest wetlands in Europe. Centuries of flooding and decay had carved a maze of rivers, peatlands, and dense forests. Each spring, the snowmelt from the Prypyat River flooded the lowlands, turning fields into Prypyat, inland seas, and leaving only ridges of dry ground like islands. Even in summer, the ground trembled underfoot, soaked by underground springs. For anyone on the move, peasant, partisan, or panzer, this was a frontier defined not by walls or trenches, but by nature itself. Generations of locals had learned to live with it. They built their homes on wooden stilts, cut reeds for roofs, and used boats where others used roads. For outsiders, though, it was a puzzle without a key. The Germans called it das Sumpfgebiet, the swamp zone, and their maps of 1941 marked it as an area of limited passability. In military terms, it was a grey patch, a place best avoided. When Operation Barbarossa began on 22 June 1941, the Prypyat lay between the two great prongs of the invasion. Army Group Center advanced toward Minsk and Smolensk. Army Group South pushed through Ukraine toward Kiev. Between them stretched this immense no-man's land of marsh and forest. German planners saw it as a buffer zone, a natural boundary that separated commands and complicated communication, but they also believed it posed no great danger after all. It held few major cities and no large concentrations of Soviet troops. That assumption soon proved costly. The first motorized columns that sidestepped the region discovered that even its edges could cripple a supply line. Roads mapped as secondary turned out to be a narrow path made of logs laid over peat. When trucks passed, they buckled. When it rained, the access road dissolved. Bridges listed, wagons tipped, and fuel trucks vanished into mud. Engineers tried to reinforce crossings with branches and gravel, but every repair washed away in the next flood. The Wehrmacht prided itself on speed blitzkrieg, the lightning war, but speed required predictable ground. Here, nothing was predictable. The land's consistency shifted by the hour. What looked solid in the morning could be impassable by afternoon. Tanks that could push through French fields were helpless in a muck where every movement created a suction trap. Even horses struggled. By early July, the German command realized that the marshes were not merely inconvenient, they were a strategic blind spot. Soviet detachments, remnants of encircled units, and civilians retreating eastward disappeared into the wetlands. Reports spoke of small groups re-emerging to cut phone lines, ambush couriers, and vanish again. For the Soviets, the marshes offered what open terrain could not: concealment. The local population, many of them hunters and fishermen, guided soldiers through reed corridors that outsiders could not navigate. The Germans reacted with a mixture of frustration and curiosity. Observation flights attempted to photograph the region, but the camera lenses showed only a uniform green expanse, broken by shining water veins. The Luftwaffe called it blind country. Commanders proposed bypassing it entirely, shifting the weight of the offensive around its southern rim. But that meant lengthening their lines by hundreds of kilometers, lines that needed fuel, food, and ammunition delivered daily from depots far to the west. To solve the swamp problem, the High Command ordered specialized units to secure the flanks between the two army groups. These were not frontline divisions, but cavalry and security regiments meant to sweep the area, protect bridges, and keep the supply routes open. Among them was a young officer named Hermann Fegelein. leading an SS cavalry brigade. Their orders would soon transform the marshes from a logistical nuisance into a killing ground, but that lay ahead. For now, the Wehrmacht's difficulties were mechanical, not moral. Engineers experimented with corduroy roads, rows of logs laid side by side to support trucks. The effort consumed immense manpower. A kilometre of corduroy required thousands of trees. Yet cutting those trees drained the same manpower needed at the front. Supply officers complained that a single week's rain could erase a month's labour. Meanwhile, the Soviets were adapting faster. In early August, retreating Red Army remnants moved east of the marshes, using small boats and captured wagons to cross floodplains. They left behind scouts and partisans to harass the occupiers. Villages hidden deep in the reeds became outposts. To the Germans, every flicker of smoke over the water might mark an ambush or a partial signal. Paranoia spread faster than the enemy itself. The natural soundscape of the marshes, buzzing insects, frog calls, the distant rumble of thunder blended with the mechanical growl of engines and the crack of rifles. Even in breaks, the men felt watched. They began calling it the swamp that breathes. At night, fog rolled over their bivouacs like slow-moving ghosts, and boots sank ankle-deep into what had once been firm ground. By September, reports from the field made their way up the chain of command. Bridges collapsing under weight, entire convoys delayed, horses dying of exhaustion in mud. One commander described the area as a country that devours motion. Still, orders came from above to press on. The Eastern War demanded momentum, and no swamp was supposed to halt it, but the land had its own agenda. As the German front lines pushed eastward toward Kiev and Smolensk, the swamp zone remained a restless gap behind them, uncontrolled, unpacified, and now sheltering the roots of resistance. The Reich's planners had marked it as an empty space. Instead, it was turning into a living frontier, one that absorbed armies, rumors, and vengeance alike. What began as a terrain obstacle was about to become something darker. In late July, a new order would arrive from Berlin, an instruction that transformed a campaign of movement into one of annihilation. The Pripet Marshes were no longer just an obstacle to be crossed. They were about to be cleansed. The first rains of July fell like a curtain over the Parisian flats, and the roads the Germans had counted on became guesses. Timber causeways, laid over peat in narrow strips, snapped under axle weight. What had looked like a country lane on a map turned out to be a balance beam over a swamp. Drivers learned to keep momentum without speed too slow, and the wheels sank too fast, and the planks sheared, throwing the truck sideways into black water. Railways brought hope, and then disappointment. The broad-gauge Soviet lines needed conversion, and sidings petered out where reed beds began. Crews worked day and night to lay standard-gauge track, only to find that the embankments slumped after a week of rain. Locomotives could reach a junction town and no farther. The last stretch, always the last stretch, required carts, horses, or men with shoulder slings, each step a wager against the ground. Fuel barrels were rolled. Along corduroy tracks of felled logs, the resin smell of fresh pine mixing with the sour smell of swamp gas. Officers compared notes and realized the marsh belt did not present a single barrier, but a series of wet fingers reaching into otherwise firm land. Columns that tried to thread the dry ribs between those fingers soon crossed one another's paths. Traffic jams blooming like obstacles in a river. Dispatch riders returned with the same report. Delay, a word that made quartermasters' knuckles whiten. Delays turned into shortages, and shortages forced choices. Ammunition or bread, fuel or medicine. Every kilometre around the Prypyat exacted a tax of time and strength. The logic of bypass seemed irresistible. Push south of the marshes toward Kiev, commanders argued, where the ground rose and the road net looked better. But avoiding a swamp this large meant lengthening lines of communication by hundreds of kilometres. Each bend around a wetland tongue required new bridges, new guards on culverts, and new depots exposed to raiding. A map could be redrawn in a morning. A bridge took men, timber, steel, and hours without interruption, a luxury the front rarely offered. Men on foot sensed the cost first. Infantry details were seconded to pioneer units to stabilize crossing points with brush and saplings. The work never ended. The peat drank the structure, and the structure demanded more trees. Teams paced off sinkholes with measuring rods, marking them with woven reed bundles that bobbed like warning buoys. Horses suffered in silence, straining on slick approaches, their hooves cutting through turf to the ooze beneath. Where a curve of causeway met a fen, wagon teams doubled up, and the air filled with the rattle of trace chains and the thud of shoulders against harness. News from the south sharpened the dilemma. Kiev drew the Axis as a magnet and a trophy. But the routes that fed that push grazed the Prypyat's western skirts. Every depot placed too near. The wetlands risked isolation when the rains hit. Every depot placed too far away risked starvation at the point of the spear. Staff officers traced pencil lines by candlelight, calculating daily tonnage under clear skies, and then carving grim margins for mud, bridge collapses, and ambushes. Under ideal conditions, a panzer division was hungry enough. Under Policia's conditions, it seemed insatiable. Meanwhile, the marshes began to answer back. Patrols sent to clear the tree lines along causeways found the paths strangely quiet, and then violently loud an explosion from a trench, a ripple of rifle shots, the echo snatched by reeds. The attackers melted into willow scrub and narrow channels that looked like shadows until you stepped into them. Reports spoke of men in worn uniforms who knew the track islands by name, who could wade waist-deep for kilometers without showing themselves, who could wait in a stand of alder while a company passed within arm's length. The occupiers tried, system and science, more observation flights, more navigation of radio traffic, more pattern analysis on supply thefts. The photographs returned as mottled green and silver, a painterly smear of water and leaf that gave no edges to hold. Intercepts revealed movement, but not routes. In the gaps of certainty, rumor flourished. Some units blamed the delays on peasants misdirecting them, others on partisan scouts guiding the enemy, still others on faulty maps drawn by men who had never stood in the breath of these wetlands. Engineers offered workarounds. Lay lattice mats under vehicle tracks, pre-assemble bridge trusses forward, employ floats on short, repeat crossings. Each proposal helped until it didn't. A lattice mat, shifted under incremental stress, turned into a slick rug. Trusses arrived but lacked bolts or crews. The nearest crane was 20 kilometers back, itself waiting for a tow. Floats saved a day and then vanished downstream in a night swell. Logistics, which in the West had been a geometry problem, here became ecology. Weight, water, growth, and decay, all arguing with human intention. On the dry islands between floodplains, German security posts appeared like affected barns, sandbags stacked, wire rolled out in shallow arcs. The outposts guarded junctions of timber roads, culverts, and ferry points. They also created targets. A post needed a week of rations and 2 weeks of ammunition. It needed a runner who could cross the same treacherous ground to carry orders and return. It needed a field telephone line that crossed miles of reed and could be cut with a pocket knife. The cost of holding the edges multiplied. Further north, where the marsh fingers reached toward the forests, whole companies learned to move by ear and step. Men counted paces between tuft and plank. NCOs touched ground with poles beyond the boot toe. A lost rhythm meant a lost man. In such terrain, courage looked different. It was patient, close to the ground, careful as a time, craftsman. The front still roared to the east, but here, momentum shrank to the width of a footpath, and the time it took for water to settle after a ripple. To the east, Soviet formations withdrawing toward the Dnieper left tripwires of small groups that refused to put distance between themselves and the invader. Some were partisans by intent, others by circumstance. All of them students of the Marsh. They harried the routes at night, lighting false beacons over useless stretches of water, floating cut logs across narrow channels to foul ferry points, spreading whispers in market towns that an ambush lay west when it lay north. They rarely stood and fought. They simply made movement feel fragile. By late summer, the pressure of the calendar overtook the pressure of the ground. Orders emphasized speed, and speed meant choosing the bigger arcs around the wettest places. The choice paid off in distance and was punished in vulnerability. The bypass lengthened supply lines and exposed their flanks to the very landscape they had tried to avoid. Columns stretched thin around the southern rim of the marshes headed toward Kiev, and the gaps between their guard posts widened like cracks in drying clay. The men who guarded those gaps heard the same chorus each evening. Frogs, wind in reeds, distant thunder. They also heard something else, wood knocking wood. A rhythm that might be a boat pole or just a tree shifting in water. The uncertainty was its own weapon. The road ahead lay clear on the map, an arrow to the prize city beyond. But the arrow's shaft now ran along the edge of a country that swallowed weight and sound, and something in that quiet, constant tug felt like a hand on the column's sleeve. They would keep moving. They had to. Yet every mile gained around the marshes frayed the lines that fed them, and in the growing space between advance and supply, a different campaign was gathering in the reeds. The order came quietly, carried by a dispatch rider whose boots still dripped with swamp water. It was late July 1941. The German High Command had grown impatient with reports of scattered ambushes and missing convoys. The culprit, they believed, was not terrain alone but bandits, the Soviet partisans who seemed to vanish into the reeds. The directive that followed would turn a landscape of confusion into one of systematic violence. Heinrich Himmler's words were clear. The Pripet Marshes were to be cleansed. The SS Cavalry Brigade, under Hermann Fegelein, was ordered to sweep the region between the Prypyat and the Dnieper. Officially, it was an anti-partisan mission. In practice, it blurred every line between combat and extermination. The brigade moved out in columns of horsemen, their hooves muffled by mud, villages that barely appeared on maps, Pinsk, David Horodok, Stolin, and hundreds more became coordinates in a deadly arithmetic. The riders advanced at dawn, their paths marked by smoke before midday. Behind them trailed supply wagons, followed by record clerks who tallied corpses. In theory, the orders distinguished between combatants and civilians. In the field, that distinction vanished. Reports from July 28 onward describe entire settlements evacuated into the swamps. Men were separated and shot. Women and children were driven toward the water. One officer recorded that the bogs were too shallow, and so the shootings continued on the banks. By early August, Himmler demanded more decisive results. The swamp itself became both instrument and witness. The reeds swallowed the sound of gunfire, and bodies sank where the mud was deep enough to hide them. Where it wasn't, villagers were forced to dig. Even the soldiers found the work disorienting. Insects thick as smoke, footing uncertain, uniforms soaked through with rot. "It is impossible to move the horses in this endless wet," wrote one cavalryman. "The land punishes us, while we punish others." The campaign lasted barely a month, but its toll was staggering. Archival figures cite roughly 14,000 Jews and suspected partisans killed by mid-September. Some historians place the number far higher. Entire districts were emptied. German situation reports described pacified areas, where nothing living remained but reeds and frogs. The marshes had been transformed from a strategic inconvenience into a laboratory of annihilation. To the regular army nearby, the operation was a grim sideshow. Wehrmacht officers complained that the SS diverted men and horses needed at the front. Yet few intervened. The killings were recorded, filed, and forwarded to Berlin under the language of counterinsurgency. Sanitizing the rear was the phrase that hid the horror. And still, resistance did not disappear. Soviet partisans who had watched from the deeper swamps waited for the columns to withdraw, then returned to the ruins to salvage weapons and survivors. From those ashes, new units formed smaller, faster, more ruthless. They struck at night, targeting supply depots and lone patrols, then vanished again into the channels. For every village erased, another pocket of defiance emerged beyond the next line of trees. The Germans answered with more sweeps. Each one covered less ground but killed more people. By late August, the SS Cavalry Brigade reported no further bandit activity, a declaration that fooled no one. The marsh remained what it had always been, a living labyrinth that defied control. Horses drowned, wagons broke, rifles rusted overnight. The reeds closed behind each patrol, as though the land itself erased the evidence. Among the soldiers, the campaign left a different kind of scar. Letters home shifted from confidence to exhaustion. Some men wrote of nightmares. The smell of swamp gas mingling with smoke, the sensation of ground giving way underfoot. They had been told they were fighting enemies. Instead, they had fought the earth. When the last detachments rode out at the end of August, the marshes fell silent again. From the air, observation crews saw nothing, no smoke, no movement, only water and forest reflecting the sky. The cleansing was declared complete, but silence in the Prypyat was deceptive. Beneath the reeds lay both the dead and the seeds of resistance that would haunt the occupiers for years. The men who carried out the orders marched on to other fronts, their reports archived as routine operations. In the swamp villages, survivors counted their losses and waited for the frost that would firm the ground enough to bury their dead. The marsh absorbed everything, the blood, the records, the truth, until only its breathing silence remained. The Germans thought the campaign had secured their flank. Instead, it had awakened something they could neither see nor kill. From the waterlogged forests came whispers of regrouping, of vengeance, stirring in the reeds. The Prypyat had swallowed armies before. Now it would begin to swallow certainties. The war in the swamps was only beginning. By the end of 1941, the great advance that had begun with speed and promise slowed to a crawl. The Wehrmacht stood deep inside Soviet territory, but its lines were stretched and brittle. The Pripet Marshes, once bypassed, now loomed at their flank like a slow-moving shadow, an expanse neither conquered nor ignored. As the first snow crusted the flooded ground, the Germans discovered that the marshes did not vanish in winter. They merely changed form. Frozen channels turned into deceptive plains, solid on the surface, liquid beneath. Trucks that dared to cross sank through ice that cracked like glass. What had been a summer swamp became a winter minefield, littered with the remains of wagons, horses, and the faint outlines of old villages lost to fire. For the front line, soldiers. The marshes were no longer just geography. They were the uncertain border between two entire army groups. To the north, Army Group Center pushed toward Smolensk and Moscow. To the south, Army Group South fought for Kiev and the Dnieper. Between them ran an empty zone 100 kilometers wide where command boundaries blurred. Coordination across that gulf was a nightmare. Radio signals failed, couriers disappeared, and rumors filled the gaps. Partisans crossing at night, bridges sabotaged, whole battalions lost in fog. The swamp was not an enemy that could be destroyed, but it dictated every move. Engineers labored to carve timber causeways and drainage trenches, trying to turn wilderness into infrastructure. Bridges sprouted like fragile ribs over the veins of the Prypyat River, each one a narrow victory against nature. Yet each kilometer gained costs hundreds of trees, thousands of man-hours, and endless repair. A single flood undid months of labor. German planners, ever precise, tried to quantify the problem. Reports listed the marsh zone as not suitable for armored warfare, but they still ordered surveillance in force to test passability. The tests ended with bogged tanks and stranded crews. A captured Soviet engineer summed it up best. "Your machines move like stones in water. Only the forest and the swamp move here." To the east, the Soviets were learning to use that movement. Along the marsh fringes, Red Army detachments regrouped, feeding supplies into partisan networks. What the Germans saw as a wasteland, the Soviets saw as a shield. Small units began slipping through reed corridors to strike railheads and telegraph posts. They vanished into waterways that even local guides found treacherous. In the balance between machine and landscape, the landscape was winning. The tension spread upward through the ranks. German divisions guarding the southern flank complained that their northern neighbours were out of reach. The marshes lay, between them unmapped, unguarded, a gap filled only by rumour. Hitler's headquarters dismissed the problem. The marshes, they claimed, had no decisive value, but for officers in the field, they had become a wound in the front line, one that could bleed from either side. By spring 1942, the thaw began again, and the entire region seemed to melt. The ice broke with thunderclaps. Rivers burst their banks. The air was filled with steam and insects. Villages that had survived the winter on the higher ridges became islands once more. In the morning, soldiers could hear the slow sweep of water rising through the forest, a sound like breath through reeds. German engineers adapted. They built floating roads of bundled brush and planks, laid on pontoons or logs chained together. Supply trucks moved at a walking pace, escorted by men probing the road ahead with poles. It was an absurd theatre of modern war, armoured columns crawling like insects across a waterlogged world. The regular army's concerns went beyond logistics. Reports of bandit activity grew daily. Partisan raids cut telegraph lines, ambushed convoys, and burned depots. Each attack forced another counter-operation. Each counter-operation another demand for men and horses. The swamp was teaching both sides endurance. On the Soviet side, commanders recognized an opportunity. The marshes separated two enemy army groups. Therefore, they could also conceal a route between them. Red Army scouts began mapping channels and forest tracks that could serve as hidden corridors. In later offensives, those paths would become arteries of advance, but in 1942 they were still whispers in the dark. To the Germans, the swamp's shadow grew heavier. Fuel shortages, axle failures, and the endless toll of horses created a rhythm of frustration. Some officers nicknamed the region the Grey Sea. It swallowed orders, men, and certainty. Even the maps degraded. Paper warped in. The humidity. Ink bled until lines turned into stains. Across the front, veterans spoke of a particular silence, found only in the marsh zone, a silence that was not peace, but listening. They felt it pressing in at dusk, when fog rose and the boundaries of land and water vanished. Outposts reported strange reflections. Lights that drifted across the fen, the echo of hoofbeats with no riders, shapes moving just beneath the mist, whether real or imagined. The effect was the same. Men hesitated, and hesitation spread like an infection. The Pripet Marshes had become more than terrain. They were a psychological frontier. They divided not only armies but certainties between control and chaos, between civilization and something older that refused to yield. By late 1942, orders came to stabilize the entire front. The Wehrmacht was no longer advancing. It was holding. And holding meant confronting every weak flank. Commanders along the marsh belt began to fortify their positions, constructing wooden bunkers on raised ridges, laying minefields on the few dry approaches, and burning villages suspected of aiding partisans. The swamp was now a border restless, dangerous, and full of ghosts. To the men stationed there, time lost shape. Days began with fog and ended with fog. Supplies arrived irregularly. Messages arrived too late. The world beyond the reeds felt distant, as if the marsh had swallowed even the war itself. But the war had not left. Beneath the waterlogged ground, something was gathering small, organized, and determined. The Germans thought they had silenced the marshes after their brutal sweeps of 1941. They were wrong. The silence was not an absence. It was waiting, and before long, it would begin to speak again in the crack of rifle fire from behind the reeds, in the torching of a convoy at midnight, in the sound of paddlers cutting through dark water, the Prypiat was preparing to answer. The reed's winter turned to mud again, and the snow melt breathed life back into the bog. The reeds returned taller, thicker, defiant. The German command had written the Pripet Marshes off as secure rear territory. But the quiet that followed their sweeps was an illusion. Beneath the canopy of birch and willow, a different army was learning how to live where machines could not. They were farmers, railway workers, and Red Army stragglers who had refused to surrender. At first, they hid, then they began to organize. By 1942, the marshes were the heart of Belarusian resistance, a world apart where German patrols dared not linger past dusk. Canoes, carved from pine trunks, carried food and ammunition through winding water channels. Horses and carts could not follow, nor could armored cars. Every reed bed became a potential base, every night a potential raid. The swamp gave both shelter and hardship. Supplies were short, rifles rusted in the damp, mosquitoes swarmed so thick that men slept under smoke veils. But for the partisans, the Prypiat was an ally, its unpredictability, their camouflage. When the wind blew over the reeds, it masked the splash of paddlers. When rain fell, the noise of engines disappeared. The swamp could hide hundreds of meters of an open road. The Germans called them Banden, bandits. To them, this was not an army but a disease spreading behind their lines. They responded with fire and statistics. Directives ordered that entire districts be cleared if partisans were reported. Columns of troops moved along the dry ridges, burning huts and confiscating livestock. Yet when they returned weeks later, the same villages had people again. Families rebuilt from ash, and the partisans reappeared out of the mist. By late 1942, the partisans' structure had hardened. Moscow sent liaison officers through airdrops and night flights, bringing radios, explosives, and doctors. In the Polessia sector alone, hundreds of small groups formed brigades linked by runners who knew each bend in the river by memory. They sabotaged rail lines that fed the German front, blew bridges on the Horin and Stier, and cut telegraph wires with improvised tools. A train could vanish in the marsh fog, derailed by a charge planted overnight. Each act of defiance invited reprisal. Anti-partisan operations multiplied. Triangle, Cotbus, Hermann. The names sounded clinical, but their methods were brutal: village encirclements, hostage shootings, and forced relocations. Some campaigns used artillery to shell entire reed belts believed to hide camps. Yet the marshes absorbed the fire and gave back silence. The Germans measured success by villages destroyed, the partisans by lines disrupted. Neither could fully claim victory. For the civilians caught between, survival became a shifting calculation. One week they cooked for German garrisons. The next, they guided Soviet scouts through the wetlands. Neutrality was impossible. Children served as messengers. Women smuggled bandages or food. Elders buried the dead of both sides in the same sodden ground. The line between soldier and villager blurred like the horizon in mist. As 1943 opened, the wider war began to turn. The defeat at Stalingrad rippled across every German headquarters, and suddenly, the Prypiat, once a forgotten flank, seemed dangerous again. Reports described increasing partisan concentration around Pinsk and Mazir. Supply convoys to the southern front had to detour hundreds of kilometers, guarded by entire battalions whose only enemy was terrain and rumor. The swamp was no longer behind the front, it was inside it. Soviet command seized the opportunity. Early that year, orders went out to coordinate partisan attacks with the Red Army's offensives. When German forces were engaged on the Dnieper, sabotage erupted along the marshes. Rail bridges blown, depots burned, telegraph masts felled one after another. The Germans fought on two fronts, the visible one of soldiers and the invisible one of mud and reeds. In the south, the Rovno-Lutsk offensive of early 1944 pushed into the marsh fringe. Soviet units advanced through the same flooded forests where the SS Cavalry Brigade had once ridden. But now, the landscape favored the attackers. Winter frost made the ground passable for weeks, and local guides, former partisans, led tanks along frozen rivers that German maps still labeled impassable. Columns emerged where no road existed, cutting behind defensive positions and forcing withdrawals. The terrain that had once crippled movement became the key to it. The Germans were stunned. For 3 years they had treated the Prypyat as a wall dividing armies. Now, the Soviets were using it as a corridor. Wehrmacht engineers rushed to fortify the remaining crossings, but their resources were drained. Bridges were dynamited not to stop pursuit, but to cover retreat. Horses died in harness. Wagons were abandoned, half sunk in mire. The front was breaking apart, and the marshes, silent witnesses, since 1941, had turned into the stage of that collapse. When spring came, the water rose again, washing over the wreckage of vehicles and the bones of men who had tried to master it. The Prypyat returned to its rhythm, indifferent yet scarred. Villagers sowed fields on the edges of old battle zones, planting grain where shells had fallen. In the reed beds, spent cartridges gleamed like fish scales in sunlight. The Germans had learned that conquest could not change geography. The Soviets learned that geography could become a weapon. Between them lay the swamp patient, vast and unburied. As the Red Army gathered strength for its final push westward, one question remained for both sides. When the front moved on, what would be left behind in the marshes, the victory of endurance, or the memory of everything the water had swallowed? By the summer of 1944, the sound of retreat echoed across the wetlands. The thunder of the Red Army's summer offensive Operation Bagration rolled westward, shaking the very foundations of the German front. For 3 years, the Pripet Marshes had been a barrier, a flank, a refuge, and a grave. Now, they became an escape route, a corridor of desperation as the German army fell back through the same terrain it had once dismissed as impassable. The order to withdraw came too late for most units. What began as an organized retreat turned into a scramble across the swamps. Roads marked on old maps had long since vanished, reclaimed by water and grass. Timber bridges built in 41 and 42 had rotted away. Convoys stumbled into reed-choked channels where only local fishermen knew the way. Even the air smelled different rot and cordite, mingling with the heavy sweetness of summer bloom. Soldiers waded waist-deep through black water, pushing carts loaded with fuel drums. The timber roads moaned under trucks overloaded with wounded. Artillery pieces were abandoned one after another, their wheels sinking until only the barrels remained above the mire. Horses that could go no further were unhitched and shot. For men already broken by exhaustion, the marshes were a final test of endurance. To the Soviets, this was an opportunity written in geography. Commanders used the marsh fringes as corridors of approach, their scouts guided by partisans who knew every hidden track. Where German forces tried to cross, Soviet troops struck from unexpected directions, materializing out of the fog. In one sector south of Pinsk, entire battalions were cut off when a causeway collapsed under artillery fire. Rescue columns sent from the rear found nothing, only broken planks floating among reeds. By now, the Wehrmacht's once proud mobility had turned to paralysis. Fuel shortages crippled vehicles. Communications faltered. Bridges were blown by retreating units faster than new ones could be built. Supply dumps meant for orderly withdrawal were swallowed by floodwater. The land that had slowed the invasion now slowed the retreat, turning defeat into disintegration. Civilians watched the chaos from half-burned villages perched on higher ground. For them, the advance of 1941, the purges of 1942, and the partisan war that followed had all blended into one long season of hunger and fear. They had learned to read the wind. The sound of shelling carried far across the open flats, and they knew which direction meant escape. When the Soviet vanguards arrived, some villagers offered water and bread. Others hid in cellars, uncertain what the new occupation would bring. For many, liberation and ruin arrived together. The Red Army engineers who followed the advance, faced the same terrain that had broken their enemies. They improvised bridges of felled trees, floated supplies on rafts, and laid railway tracks across peat where ballast could not hold. The swamp slowed everyone equally, friend and foe alike. It was said that a single kilometre of forward movement through the marshes could take a day, and yet the drive continued. Behind the front, Soviet officers marked the wrecks of German vehicles for salvage, while local partisans guided units toward untouched depots. The marsh had once concealed guerrillas, now it concealed opportunity. Everywhere, the remnants of the occupation surfaced. In shallow ponds, villagers found rifles and helmets still wrapped in algae. In the ruins of isolated hamlets, investigators discovered the mass graves of 1941, the ones dug during the cleansing 3 years earlier. The peat preserved everything: bones, boots, even scraps of uniform. The landscape itself testified, layer upon layer, to what had happened within it. For the Germans, there was no organized defense left in this sector. Units fell back toward Brest and the Bug River. Those that made it out carried more than losses. They carried memories of the swamp's relentless drag, its unyielding hold. One officer wrote in his diary, "The land itself fights us. Every road is an enemy. Every night the earth takes back what we build." By August, the front had moved west beyond the Prypyat basin. The thunder faded, leaving behind silence again, except now the silence was heavy with debris. Abandoned helmets lined the riverbanks. Wooden crosses marked the graves of both armies, their names already fading under mould. In some villages, children played on wrecked vehicles, unaware of the lines their parents had crossed to survive. To the Soviets, victory was tangible. The swamp barrier had been breached, the enemy driven back. But to those who had lived within its borders, the marshes offered no triumph, only endurance. Their homes were gone, their families scattered, yet the land remained the same restless expanse that had defied armies. In time, the soldiers and partisans moved on, and the Prypyat returned to its rhythm of water and wind. The marsh covered the tracks of war, as it had covered so much else. But beneath its surface lay everything that had happened here: the buried convoys, the drowned bridges, the unmarked graves. The swamp did not forgive or remember. It simply absorbed. By the time the guns fell silent that autumn, the Pripet Marshes were once again a frontier of quiet. The war had retreated, but its echo lingered in rusting steel, in the stillness of ponds, and in the uneasy peace that followed. And though the front now rolled far to the west, those who passed through would never forget the lesson the marshes had taught: that no empire, no ideology, no machine could conquer the ground that refused to bear them. The swamp had been patient. It always would be. When the fighting finally moved west, the marshes fell eerily still. The armies were gone, but the war had not ended here. Smoke still rose from villages on the drier peaks, and scattered munitions rusted where the water was shallow. For those who returned, the farmers, the widows, the children, the landscape itself, seemed haunted. At first glance, Prypyat looked unchanged. The reeds were green again, and the willows bent over mirrored channels. But underfoot, the peat was different, churned with metal and bone. Every step revealed something left behind: a helmet, a boot, a piece of wire that once carried orders. The war had saturated the land so completely that peace felt unnatural. Soviet recovery teams arrived soon after the front passed. They came not as soldiers, but as surveyors of loss tasked to map, to record, and to reclaim what could be saved. Trains brought engineers and investigators, their rail cars filled with wooden stakes and notebooks. The marshes, once a military frontier, became a humanitarian one, the dividing line between the living and the missing. In Pinsk, the first reports of the cleansed villages reached officials. Entire communities had vanished in 1941, their names now reappearing only as smudged entries in field logs. Search teams followed rumors into the reed beds, guided by those who had survived by hiding there years earlier. They found shallow depressions in the peat, the outlines of trenches long since filled with water. When they dug, the ground released a sour breath, and the marsh gave up its dead. No memorials marked these places then. The Soviet state preferred to fold the story into one of collective heroism: partisans, liberation, victory. But those who lived nearby remembered the difference between dying in battle and disappearing in silence. At dusk, women left flowers on the reed banks, unmarked but not forgotten. The marshes did what they had always done. They preserved. The anaerobic peat kept what it swallowed. Decades later, archaeologists and farmers would unearth relics, uniforms intact, weapons unfired, photographs sealed in mud. The swamp had become an archive that did not care who read it. Strategically, the war had proven what generals already knew but seldom admitted. Terrain is destiny. In the east, rivers could be bridged and forests burned, but the Prypyat remained unconquerable. For the Germans, it was a slow-motion catastrophe. For the Soviets, a reluctant ally that sheltered them in their weakest hour and opened paths for their return. In its indifference, it had shaped victory and defeat alike. As the Cold War began, the Polesia frontier was redrawn between Soviet republics. The swamp, once fought over, slipped again into obscurity. Pinsk rebuilt its quays, Mazir opened timber mills, and some sections of the marsh were drained for peat and farmland. Yet vast tracts remained untamed, too deep, too wild, too full of ghosts. In the decades that followed, veterans who revisited the area struggled to recognize it. Rivers had shifted, reed lines had moved, and nature had erased the coordinates of their memories. Only the sounds remained: the drone of insects, the stillness before dawn, the breath of fog rising over water. Many spoke of feeling watched, as if the marsh itself remembered. Today, satellites still show that same mosaic of green and silver that once baffled pilots in 1941. Few visible traces of the war survive, but beneath the surface lie its layers: rust, wood, ash, and bone. Each spring, the floods rise and blur the past a little more. Yet on quiet mornings, when mist hovers low, locals say you can still hear the land hum softly, as though the earth itself is remembering. The Pripet Marshes were never a battlefield in the traditional sense. They were an element, a condition as decisive as weather, as constant as time. They consumed arrogance, rewarded patience, and proved that no empire, ideology, or machine can master the ground that refuses to bear them. And so they remain vast, watchful, unchanged, keeping the secrets of every army that thought it could cross them. History is often written by generals, but in the Pripet Marshes, it was written by the land itself. If you'd like to explore more untold stories of World War II's hidden fronts, remember to like, share, and subscribe for the next journey.